All right, hi everybody. My name is Joshua Burgeon. I am the general manager for the EC2 Spot business, and I'm here to talk to you about the one weird API request that'll save you thousands. Hopefully you're in the right room. So for those of you not familiar with Spot instances, they are spare EC2 instances that you can bid on and save significant amounts to run your cloud computing applications. Spot significantly reduces the cost of your applications, allowing you to grow your compute capacity and throughput for the same budget, potentially enabling new types of cloud computing applications. So I want to talk a little bit about the scale of AWS when you think about Spot. These are statistics you might have heard before, but AWS has 1 million active customers in 190 countries. We have over 11 regions, 30 availability zones. EC2 instance usage increased 93% year over year, comparing 2014 to 2013. And S3 holds trillions of objects and peaks at 1 million requests per second. So when you think about spare capacity, I want you to think about the capacity of AWS and then think about what Spot means to you underneath that. Why use Spot? Relatively simple. I think most people out here in the audience like saving money. Spot can save you up to 90% off the on-demand price, and typical savings average in the 80% range. So one of our customers, Novartis, used Spot to process 39 years of computational chemistry of drug research using 80,000 cores, over 10,000 Spot instances. They did this in 9 hours at a cost of only $4,232. So that's the kind of power you can get with Spot. Lyft, some of you may be familiar with them, ride-sharing service. Quote here, friend of mine, Matthew Leventi, found it sort of hard to believe, but 4 lines of code later, saving $15,000 a month for his continuous integration workloads, all running on Spot. And AdRoll, running petabyte-scale data pipelines using Docker, Luigi, and Spot instances, peaking at 50 billion impressions. So, using Spot, relatively simple things that you need to keep in mind. The first is Spot is a market that the price of compute changes based on supply and demand. And it's actually not one market. I'll get into that in a little bit, but there are many individual Spot markets. And then you will never pay more than your bid. With Spot, you are bidding on the compute capacity, and you get to define what the bid is that you want to put in. And when the market exceeds your bid, you get 2 minutes to wrap up your work. We call this the instance termination notification. So let's dive into this a little bit. We have made Spot significantly easier to use over the last year. One of the first innovations we brought to the market is something called the Spot Bid Advisor. This is available on our website now. The Spot Bid Advisor allows you to put in your compute requirements, such as CPU and memory, and which region you want to operate in, and tell us how much you're willing to bid, 25%, 50%. Maybe you're willing to bid 100% of the on-demand price. Again, that's the maximum you would pay, but if the market price is significantly lower than that, you pay the market price. So those are the input requirements. And what you'll see here is that there's a large number of instances over the past week and month where the chance of you being interrupted on Spot is incredibly low. If you see the word low here and you see a green, that means you would not have been interrupted at any point if you were bidding 50% of on-demand. And more importantly, although you bid 50% of the on-demand price, the average savings, which you can see in the column here, was 85 to 91%. So Spot can be an incredibly powerful tool for saving money and accelerating your applications. So now, in recent months, we've also introduced something called Spot Fleet, which does all of the heavy lifting of taking this kind of information and making it work for you. So I will get to that in a minute if you haven't used it. If you want to use it right now, you can. It's available. So I said Spot markets. It's very easy to think of spare capacity at scale for Amazon as one big monolithic block, but it really isn't. Every instance family, every size, every availability zone, in every region is a separate Spot market. So why is that important? Well, these different Spot markets have uncorrelated supply and demand curves. And that means while you might see a spike in the supply or demand in one market, you're unlikely to see exactly correlated supply and demand spikes in another market. That's one of the powers where if you diversify your Spot investments across multiple Spot markets, you can maintain your capacity consistently. So I also talked about bid price and market price. This is an example of a Spot instance pricing history. This is also available on our website and is an API. So here we have an example, which is a R34XL in US East, and this is over a week. It's just a snapshot. The on-demand price is $1.40. Again, you pay the market price, which right now in this example is quite a bit cheaper. Let's say you bid 25% of the on-demand price. That's the spot bid you put in. During the last 7 days, any time that the spot market price exceeded 25%, which was a few times, you would experience an interruption. However, you consistently saved 85% and paid less than that 25%. So let's say I changed my bid. What if I bid 50% of the on-demand price? In this example, you can see there was only a single time during the last 7 days that my instance would be interrupted. And although I bid 50%, the only time I was paying anywhere near that was that one little spike in the curve here. I'm going to take it one step further. If I bid 75% of on-demand, I would have kept my instance this entire week. And again, because you only pay the market price, I still would have saved 84%. You know, the small change there is that spike that you have to pay for that hour or two. So that's a quick run through of Spot instances and what they are. Since this is a 300 level course, I assume you guys are interested in the deep dive. And I'm going to give it to you. So this is the new stuff, right? This is the exciting things. And get out your cameras. Spot Fleet, I've talked about this before. If you haven't used it, it's fantastic. It is our API introduced in May. Allows you to launch 1, 2, 3, or 3,000 instances in a single API call using the 1 instance type, 5 instance types, 20 instance types, multiple availability zones, whatever works for you. We have multiple allocation strategies, so you can tell us to put your Spot Fleet in the best price pool or diversify your investments like an index fund across multiple pools. That helps protect you from price spikes. And you can apply a custom weighting factor to your Spot Fleet, so you can tell us that your fleet scales based on the number of cores, or your fleet scales best based on the amount of memory, or some custom unit that applies specifically to your application. So, Spot Fleet, we launched it in May. Very excited, but we didn't stop there. We added the lowest price availability zone option in July. Weighted bidding, which is the feature I just mentioned. The ability to distribute your fleet across multiple capacity pools, which we call the diversified option. And then most recently, just last week, we offered the ability using the Modify API to increase or decrease the size of your running fleet. And we're hardly finished. I wish we were. I could kind of relax. So, launching a Spot Fleet is super easy. You just create a JSON blob by hand, fire up Vim. I assume all of you are copying this down and doing it now. This is a 300 level course. You are totally free to do that. We launched a console last week that makes this super easy to learn and understand. In fact, the console is so awesome that after using this great interactive interface to set up your fleet, learn about how Spot works, create your configuration, you can simply click a button and output that JSON config file. And I see some of you nodding, that's very exciting. So then after that, if you prefer to work in the command line or the API or build your own tooling, it's simple to get started. So you really have no excuse. I'm also here to talk about Spot Blocks, which some of you may have heard of. We launched that this week. We're very excited about this. I've talked about how great Spot is and how infrequently you're going to experience interruptions and how you can keep your instances for weeks and months at a time. That sounds great. But some of you say to me, I have an MPI workload. I have a batch workload that absolutely I'm moving over from my data center. It has to run continuously. Guess what? We have Spot instances that are running continuously for up to 6 hours. You can save up to 50% off the on-demand pricing. You're buying a little bit of insurance policy. And all it takes is a single additional parameter. You can see this here. We have the command line example and the API example. So you can launch one of these right now. We had people launching these as soon as minutes after we created Spot Blocks. So if you tell me there's some reason you can't use Spot because you can't face interruptions, I'm telling you that excuse is gone. So 6 hours, why did we pick 6 hours? One of our advanced technology partners, Cloud Health, which helps give you insights into how your applications run, has done some analysis. 21% of the workloads running on AWS run in less than an hour. 35% in less than 2 hours. 40% in less than 3 hours. So roughly 50% of the workloads out there live for less than 6 hours. So all of these people right now could be saving up to 50% off the on-demand price using Spot blocks. So I'm pretty sure that it's worth your time to make a single additional API call. So now we're going to deep dive. I'm going to rush through very quickly some best practices for using EC2, and then explain the super, super complicated additional best practices for Spot. It's going to take a very long time. And then we're going to run through 3 use cases that hopefully are applicable to you. So best practices for EC2. This should be kind of a refresher if you're using AWS. These are not required, but these are things that make your application run best in the cloud. Stateless, fault-tolerant. You should always be prepared for some kind of fault. Not everything has instance termination notifications like Spot instances, but anything can happen. Multi-AZ, we always recommend people work in more than one availability zone to provide the best availability to their customers, and to be loosely coupled. These are just development best practices, right? They apply to everything on EC2. So now I'm going to delve into thousands of slides about, I'm just kidding. So Spot, one thing, instance flexibility. The only difference between a Spot application and a best practice EC2 application is that if you can use multiple instance types, you're going to have the best Spot experience. I mentioned this, that's why we built Fleet. So let's dive into Hadoop. And this applies whether you're using Amazon EMR or not. This is a typical Hadoop architecture. You have your core instance group running. You have your master instance node. And you scale typically by just adding more nodes to your core instance group. Those nodes are running HDFS, and they're also running your tasks. So what about Spot? If you split your task instance group from your core instance group, you can run those on Spot since you're not running your HDFS or your data on them. And you can scale and save a significant amount of money. This is actually what almost all of our EMR customers use. And one of the best things is with the introduction of Yarn, there's native support for heterogeneous instance types, which means you can use a C38XL, you can use an R38XL, you can use an R34XL, and you can scale up your cluster as big as you need. And because you're saving 80 to 90%, you can bust through that 6-month backlog queue you have of low priority work that you would never cost effectively be able to scale up on your own data center. Or think about it as time is money. If you're not willing to spin up 1,000 on-demand instances because of the cost, why not spin up 1,000 Spot instances, which is the cost of 100 on-demand instances? Get the results back to your users faster. So how does this work in practice? It all depends on how flexible you are. So this is the Spot Bid Advisor. I always advise everybody to start with the Spot Bid Advisor. I am going to be flexible within family in this application. So this is Hadoop, remember, right? If I can use a C3 extra large for my application, I can absolutely use a 2XL, a 4XL, an 8XL. These are all going to provide similar or better performance than my base instance. Now you're telling me, I don't want a C3 8XL. It's really costly. We're using Spot. It's still going to be 80% off the on-demand pricing. So I hope nobody in the audience is thinking I can't use 8 times the performance for the same price as my current instance. Since we're talking about Hadoop and Yarn, I'm also flexible across families. If I can use a C3, I can use an R3. So together, just in these 2 examples, I have 8 instances, which are 8 different Spot markets. However, since this is Hadoop and there's a lot of data traffic back and forth between my master and core nodes and my task trackers, I'm not going to want to send all of that across multiple zones. You don't have to feel too bad. You've already got 8 different Spot instance families. So I'm going to select a single availability zone and maybe a specific subnet if I'm using VPC. So this was all done using the Spot console. What do I get? I get a nice configuration screen. I can actually launch this directly from the console with a single click. Or if you prefer, you can click this button here, get that really nice JSON file that I talked about earlier. You can do this once and then keep editing the JSON files by hand afterward, or you can do this every time. It's totally up to you. The console is free. So what happens? I created this example here. What happens in the real world? We ran that exact same configuration, which was a request of 1,000 cores. We ran it over 30 days. How did it perform in the real world? So these are the stats. On average, we kept all 1,000 of those cores that we asked for. 99% of the time, we maintained that capacity. The biggest dip was to 848, 16% lower. And you can see how temporary it was. More importantly, of course, the average price was around a penny a core. So that's a savings of over 81%. One API call, done. So HDFS, you thought, that's great. My tasks are saving lots of money. I want to save even more money. I'm so excited. I want to save money. So you have two options here, of course. We always recommend EMR. They're our brothers and sisters. You can also use spot blocks. I mentioned this earlier. So you don't want your master node and your core nodes to go down. That might cause data corruption. And you might think, I'm out of luck. No, spot blocks. If your cluster lives for less than 6 hours, there's really no reason not to use this. And then also, there are significant savings over doing things yourself if you're going to use EMRFS. You don't have to, but I would be happy if you did. So takeaways, what are you going to do right now? Although maybe don't leave the presentation yet. I have 2 more examples. Number 1, run your task nodes separately. You can immediately use Spot for all of them. Number 2, consider spot blocks if you have a cluster that lives for less than 6 hours. So what does EC2 Spot Fleet do for you? Saves you money, saves you time, manages all the instances for you, and then it accelerates the results. You think about the power of getting your results back 10 times faster at a tenth the cost. What are the things you're not doing now that you would be doing if it were cost effective? So a couple of specific examples. One of them is Bloomreach. So they launched about 2,000 EMR clusters and 6,000 Hadoop jobs every day, and they're saving 80% on average. Another example is one of my favorite customers, AdRoll. They're an ad tech company. So they started out with S3. It took about 2 weeks to get up and running on AWS. Now they're storing about 1.5 petabytes of data, and they use a base of on-demand instances and then scale up and down based on load using Spot instances. 50 billion impressions cost effectively. That's Hadoop. So on to web applications. I hope you're starting to get a flavor that there really isn't anything you can't do on Spot. So many of you are familiar with this kind of architecture. So it's a little bit different. I want to pay attention on this slide. This is your typical web application. You've got your users, your ELB. You've got something like Dynamo or Cassandra or Redis storing the data, so your servers are stateless. Right here is your Spot Fleet. So we're going to start with a Spot Fleet example, and then for those of you who use auto-scaling, I'll get into that. So how do you diversify? You're going to use multiple Spot instances, multiple availability zones, which is always a best practice for best availability for your customers when you're building a web tier application. And then because it's a web tier and you're using an ELB, you are going to want to pick instances that have similar performance characteristics. So if you're picking a C3 large, the other large families, so M3, M4, R3, C4, those are going to have similar performance characteristics, which makes it easier for the ELB to handle the scaling for you. It's not an absolute requirement, but it's a little more complex to work across different sizes. So back to how flexible you are. Load up the bid advisor. You're probably getting tired of me saying this. Load up the bid advisor. Explore the Spot instances that work for you. Here I have an example where I think there's 10 instance families where I'm willing to pay a maximum of an on-demand price, but again, I will typically save 80% or more. All of these instances, you face an almost zero probability over the last month that your instance was terminated. So again, I told you to prepare for termination, but it's not a very common thing. So I'm going to go to the Spot console. I'm going to select C3 extra large, C3 2. No, I'm not going to do that. That's going to give me weird ELB results. You're not out of luck. Again, you are flexible across families. You are certainly flexible across families. I hear developers say all the time, I can only run on an R3. And to that I say pish posh. And that is very unlikely to be the case. Even if you only have 2 instance families that you're flexible across, that is twice as much protection from spot market fluctuations, and more importantly, twice as much capacity that you have access to. And again, I am flexible across zones because I am a web tier. So if I have 4 instance families and 4 availability zones, that is 16 spot markets I'm flexible across. So here we have 5 instance types. Let's pretend they're 5 availability zones. I have a target capacity of 50 instances. My web tier needs 50 instances to be running all the time to have good performance for my customers. I'm going to get the JSON file. I'm going to go into the API and set up my requests. Off I go. So what happened when we ran this? We requested 50 instances. over the last 30 days, we never drop below 45. So never, that's 0, not like sort of never. If you wanted 50, that's really what your performance characteristics required. You saved 85%, and 98% of the time had exactly the capacity you need. Let me flip that upside down. What if you only wanted 45? Then you had the capacity 100% of the time, and you still saved 83%. Like the wheels should be turning. You can over-provision 50% and still save 50%. So this changes the way you might think about scaling. This changes the way you think about application performance. You have users out there and you think, I could save 100 milliseconds on each of their requests, but I'm not going to spin up twice as many on-demand instances to do that. I'm running a fleet of 50 on-demand instances. It's not cost-effective to launch 100 just to shave 100 milliseconds off of each web request. Well, what if I could launch another 50 for the cost of 5? You think your users would like that? Time is money. So, some additional considerations. Session state, how to use ELB effectively with Spot, and the 2-minute warning that I've mentioned. Session state, you can use any database you want. You could use flat files. We love Dynamo. One of the great things about Dynamo is that the data is automatically replicated across availability zones, so there's no work for you when you're using Spot Fleet in multiple availability zones. Absolutely not a requirement. You can choose other databases, Cache, Elasticache, RDS, so forth. Then ELB, there's a couple of very specific nuances that help Spot Fleet work really well. The first is cross-zone load balancing. This ensures you have essentially the proper amount of resources in your multiple availability zones. And then the last one is, if you have these in-flight requests coming in and you do experience the instance termination notification, if you change your connection draining timeout to be 90 seconds, that allows you to essentially fulfill those incoming requests and then deregister from the ELB. So in fact, if you're building a web tier application and you follow this architecture pattern, your users won't even notice that the Spot instances went away. This is true if you used ELB, which I've heard some customers do for batch workloads as well. So 2-minute warning, very simple. You can check for the 2-minute warning using bootstrap actions or cron jobs or anything that's running on your AMI. We've used an example. We actually have a blog post about this, where every 5 seconds we check for the instance termination notification. Here's the script. You can copy this down. It's not copyright. You can build your own. You don't have to use shell scripts. All we're doing here is checking for the warning. If so, we're going to detach from the ELB. We've got 90 seconds. Request is fulfilled. Customer moves on. Otherwise, we don't do anything. Sleep for 5 seconds. That's how simple it is if any of you are in any way worried about Spot instance termination. So I also mentioned autoscaling. Some of you are out there saying, I scale my web tier using autoscaling. That's great. We want you to continue to use it. Very simple. You can create 2 autoscaling groups, one for your on-demand and reserved instances, and you can create an additional autoscaling group with Spot. Both autoscaling groups are behind the same ELB. So here we are using the bid advisor again to select the right instance type, because autoscaling currently doesn't support multiple instance types in the same autoscaling group. You can also create multiple autoscaling groups if you want to mimic the features in Fleet. So I'm going to select a C3 large. So again, I'm going to bid 100% of the on-demand price. And you think, but I don't want to pay the on-demand price. The average savings here is quite a bit bigger than the on-demand price. But bidding 100% of the on-demand price means you ride out those small fluctuations in the spot market. If I bid 100% of the on-demand price, the frequency with which I was interrupted on this C3 large was 0 in the past month. So I go to Autoscaling Console. All I do is copy it, create one that says request Spot instances, and I'm done. It's pretty simple. So looks slightly different than the previous slide, but it's the same idea. Essentially here you have 2 autoscaling groups, one for Spot, one for on-demand and reserved instances. Otherwise, it's the exact same architecture. There's no difference. So you can save 90% whether you use autoscaling, whether you don't use autoscaling. You can mimic all the features in Fleet if you like, but we would certainly suggest you spend your time on things that are more differentiating for your business. So a couple examples of people who followed this architecture to good success. One is Pinterest. Some of you may have heard of them. They recently crossed the 100 million monthly active users mark. So they were able to cut their costs from $54 an hour to $20 an hour. That's 60%, using a mixture of on-demand and reserved instances for their base, and then scaling up using Spot. Also, Service Source, they built a microservices architecture application and run all of it on Spot instances. We are a huge fan of microservices, and containers are almost perfect for Spot. Because they developed this cloud-friendly architecture, it helps them save significantly, 80% on average. The last use case I want to run into is batch processing with EC2 Spot. And batch processing is a huge area. And I'm going to only cover it in a very shallow amount here, but I think a lot of you can think of the different examples: a Monte Carlo simulation, molecular modeling, media processing, rendering, high energy simulations, queues of reports that you have running now. Everybody's got batch processing workloads in their data center or running on AWS right now. You can save up to 90%, and these are the perfect jobs for Spot. So how does that work? It's not possible for me to incorporate every batch services architecture in a single slide. Yours may look different than this, but basically we have common elements such as your VPC, and you have essentially what are like task nodes and a master node that doles out work and keeps track of what people are doing, and some kind of database element. Again, you might not look exactly like this, but the details are not important. So what am I here to talk about? I'm not here to talk about all the elements like your database and your master node and your scheduler. I hope you're happy with those. If you're not, we probably have some options for you. But I'm here to talk about how do you dole out work, and how is it cost effective for you using Spot. So again, all batch processing architectures share a pretty typical pattern. The worker nodes get job parts from some kind of queue. In this case, I'm going to say SQS. They perform single tasks based on the task state in a database, in this case, DynamoDB. So they store the input objects in a file system such as EFS, or local instance store, or EBS. Again, you may not look exactly like this. None of these are requirements to use Spot. So every job can often be further split into multiple subparts. The more you do this, the more Spot instances you can take advantage of, and the faster you can get your work done. And then you stitch all the work together, upload it back to a data store like S3, or use multi-part upload. It's pretty typical. Hopefully this resonates with you guys. So you can scale really large for your batch processing grids using Spot Fleet. You can do this yourself, but it gets increasingly complex to manage all of the parts. So Spot Fleet does all of that undifferentiated heavy lifting for you. So you can set up this heterogeneous, scalable grid of Spot instances with different capacity pools for your workers. And you can use Spot blocks for your less flexible jobs that have to run continuously. Almost all batch processing is in some form discrete. So let's go back to this how flexible are you idea. Batch processing, as I mentioned, is kind of the perfect use case for Spot. You go back to the bid advisor. Maybe you're really price sensitive. The maximum you're willing to pay is 25% of the on-demand price. If the Spot price rises above that, if you're not saving 75% or more, you want us to terminate your instances. Even in that case here, we have all of these instance types where you saved an average of, I think it's 88% here, with the probability of interruption being incredibly low over the past week and the past month. Typically, batch processes run for less than that. So I hop over to my Spot console. I am definitely flexible within family. If I can use a C3 4XL, I can use a C3 8XL. So I've already got 2 Spot instance pools. I am definitely flexible across family. If I can use the C3 4XL and 8XL, I can use the C4s, the CC2s, the D2s. I can split my tasks into tiny parts. I could probably use every instance type that Amazon has available. We've got some screaming deals on the older instance types. I'm also flexible across zones. Again, if I'm using any kind of regionalized service, like DynamoDB, the data transfer is free within the region. So I'm going to select all the availability zones here, right? So now I've got something like 8 Spot instance types and 2 availability zones, 16 Spot pools. It's most certainly going to have the capacity available to me that I'm asking for. Again, spit out your JSON file, you're off to the races. What happens? Here's my grid. I requested 1,000 cores Over the last 30 days, what did I achieve? On average, I actually achieved more than my capacity. Slight fluctuations, Spot Fleet keeps relaunching instances. I averaged a cost of 1 penny per core that entire time. That's a savings of 80%. So your grid the entire time was giving you 99% of the time the exact amount or more of the capacity you asked for at a savings of 80% on average with no work from you beyond the initial setup. Even if your tasks are interrupted, if you're saving 80%, I think you can afford to have them restarted. So how do we capitalize on the 2-minute warning if we've got a batch process or a grid? Very simple. It's exactly like the web tier, only maybe we do a little bit more wrap up because we can't drain from our ELB. So again, we check for the 2-minute notification every 5 seconds. Here's a sample script. Yours might look different. I'm going to check for the 2-minute warning. I might write my data to disk. I might update the session state in DynamoDB so that it says, hey, I need to be restarted, or hey, I finished, or here's how much I finished, so that when the master node doles out the work next time, it knows exactly where to pick up. If there's no instance termination notification, I just keep processing till I'm done. Super simple. Now you're sitting through this entire thing and you're thinking it's super awesome, Spot Fleet sounds great, I can't use it. None of my tasks can be interrupted. Blocks. They run continuously for 1 to 6 hours. You save up to 50% off the on-demand price. Single parameter. So you can launch these right now. They're live. They're generally available every region where Spot is available, which is almost all of them. So you might want to say, OK, that's great. Is anybody using this in the real world? Of course, there are a few. So one is Schrodinger. They used 156,314 node Spot cluster, a very specific number, for computational chemistry. So they estimated that to process the 205,000 organic compounds would have taken them 264 years on a single machine. They completed this in 18 hours using Spot. At a max, they achieved 1.21 petaflops for about $33,000 for the entire job, so that's 16 cents a molecule. I mentioned Novartis earlier. This was actually an example from several years ago, not 7 years ago. So they were virtually screening 10 million compounds against a common cancer target. They completed this in less than a week. But the amazing thing is when they estimated how much would this cost to do internally. I want to do this work internally. Their data center team estimated that it would take a $40 million investment to spin up that much computational power. And are they going to do that? Nobody's going to do that. Number one, they don't have the time. Number two, that capacity is just going to sit idle when this job is done. So they partnered with Cycle Computing and AWS. Again, I mentioned this, they launched 87,000 cores across 10,000 Spot instances, processed 39 years of research in 9 hours for slightly over $4,000. I am not a math expert, but 4,000 is less than 40 million. So here we are at the summary. The first thing you need to take away is AWS is spare capacity at scale. I mentioned this earlier. We have 1 million active customers from 191 countries operating in 11 regions, 30 availability zones. We've grown 100% year over year. When you think about the scale that AWS is operating at, and you think about spare capacity, I don't want you to think, it's a tiny sliver. And it's huge, and we're growing more and more every day. Number two, we do all the heavy lifting for you. Anybody who in the audience has been using Spot for a long time, thank you very much. You are hopefully finding it a good thing to use. But what I'm here to tell you is that we're going to continue to invest in making it easier for you to use all of this spare capacity that I'm talking about. I don't want to have to hear that you're spending a lot of time up at night worrying about bidding strategies or where the spare capacity is or fluctuations in the market. When you use Spot Fleet or Spot blocks, we do all of that work for you, so you can get on to other things. And the third is you pocket the savings. Now, pocketing the savings means two things. One is you can run exactly as much work as you were running before. You can save up to 90%. You can take that money. You can just kind of walk away and be happy. I mean, that's great. I'm not here to tell you that's the wrong thing to do. But I want you to start thinking, what could I do if it costs 90% less? Could I take a workload that I only run once a month because it's incredibly expensive for me to find the computational time? Could I take a regulatory compliance workload that I begrudgingly run on my cluster after kicking everybody else off? What if I could run that every day? What kind of operational intelligence would my analysts have if I ran that every day? What if I've got a 6-month backlog of work that all these people are screaming at me to get done? We have people burning through that in a week on Spot. Time is money. So I am obviously here for questions afterward, but you're all going to immediately, furiously do 3 things. Number 1, I've mentioned this before, try the Bid Advisor. Super easy to use. It's on our website. It's available right now. We also have a GitHub, in our public GitHub, there is a Python script-based version of this, if you prefer that. Gives you very similar information. This just allows you to get started with Spot, explore the markets, see where the best deals are, what might work for you. Fire up the Spot console. I am super excited about this. This is one of our biggest innovations in years. I know everybody out here is a developer and they're super well versed with all of our APIs, but we consistently hear from people, that's great, I love your APIs, but before I get started, can you make it a little easier? That's the Spot console. For those of you more comfortable in the console, you never need to leave it. But for those of you who think the console is great, I only wish I had it in the API, everything you can do in the console, you can do in the API. Just doesn't look as pretty. And the last one is block some time. If you're thinking, I have a workload, I'd like to get started on Spot, I'm scared of interruption. I don't want to check for the instance termination notification. You know what? Launch a Spot instance right now, specify the block duration minutes in 1 to 6 hour increments. That instance will run continuously for that time. So that's my presentation. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And please don't forget to complete your evaluations.